So it's a little odd to have my talk sandwiched, literally sandwiched into a session on inequality, but Shulamit's final words about Barbara Tuchman's separation of theory and practice actually is a pretty good segue to what I want to talk about. And to the extent it is about inequality, it's about inequalities that are not of the economic kind, but of knowledge rights and political rights. So I want to situate my talk between two images. And the first one is that, which will be familiar to most people in this audience. But let it imprint itself on your retinas, because the next image will not be familiar to anybody in this audience unless they've heard me before. And that's this. And that second image is from the People's Climate March in 2014 in New York. So we've been talking about a very ancient word, democracy, and surrounding it with other things that are also very ancient, like liberalism, and yet the sort of transformative changes in the world in these hundreds of years between, or thousands of years when concepts were invented and when they were played out in the practice of people's lives, that has not been attended to very much. And in particular, the transformative changes brought about by science and technology. Of course, in Shlomo's first talk, he already mentioned social media, so it's not that science and technology are not with us in the room, but nevertheless, the analysis of what it is people are doing when they're thinking that they're doing democracy and what that means for us today, and how science and technology as interventions into contemporary and modern life alter our very understanding of who we are and what we're doing. That is the thing that I want to dwell on. So citizens and subjects are in crisis, and how do we situate that crisis? How do we even begin to understand it if we put the role of science and technology back into the center of our analysis? So yesterday, somebody said that people are marching in the streets, but they're not marching for political institutions, and they're not marching for democracy, they're marching for climate. And I wonder if that is a true statement. That is, what are they doing when they're marching for climate? And to address that, I think one question to ask is, how does technology figure in the practices of democracy beyond the fact that we have something called social media? So what I want to talk about is three, what I will characterized as constitutional moments. Those of you who are familiar with Bruce Ackerman's work will know that he talks about constitutional moments, but he talks about them in a way similarly to what I do. That is, these are moments when life reorganizes itself in such a way that transformations of constitutional import happen without formal recourse to constitutionalism as such. But I want to suggest that this is an incomplete understanding unless one takes the refigurations of people and their participation in politics on board in relation to the scientific and technological resources and materials at our disposal. So I will talk very briefly out of a lifetime of the work about the configurations of the political subject, about configurations of power, and although Joseph Nye is my colleague at the Kennedy School, my way of thinking of power is not about hard, soft, and smart, and about configuring futures. So one of the things that the note I want to end on is that the future has opened up partly because of science and technology into a space of politics, and that creates very different ideas of how democracy ought to happen from the politics of the present as we used to understand it. So configuring the political subject. So parts of this have been alluded to already and are known. It's about the emergence of the figure of the expert. We've already talked a little bit about the alienation of citizens in contemporary life because their distance to their political rulers is too mediated, and there are layers upon layers of specialized knowledge that they have no access to. This is an image that gives you a sense of just how ancient this is. So this is Hendrik ter Bruggen's painting of Doubting Thomas, of St. Thomas. But what I find really interesting in this particular image is the third figure. So it's not just St. Thomas doing his seeing is believing act of putting his finger in the wound to understand it, but I'm sure there are art historians who could tell me more about it. I was just struck at a meeting on Caravaggio's influence on the Dutch painters in seeing this third figure, who to me is the expert. I mean, that it is somebody who's witnessing the act of witnessing, if you will, and is providing a sense of mediation. And this is centuries and centuries old, and this is something about how we become enlightened today, not by our own knowledge, but by through these mediated layers of other people attesting. And I love the way the glasses are situated on his nose to allow him to see more clearly and better on the expert side of things. So this is a contemporary statement by a colleague of Linda Greenhouse, in a sense, Ross Douthat. It's a very recent column in which he talks about, I mean, the title of the column is Exhausted with the Experts, and he actually endorses Sanders and Biden as the two non-technocratic candidates running on the Democratic side. But notice the distrust of technocracy, the sense that the smartest guys in each political coalition can't really be trusted, the feeling that the whole model of credentialed meritocracy is corrupt and self-dealing. So this is not about lack of access to knowledge. It's a sense that these experts are in it for themselves in some sense and have become a new kind of political force and corrupt and self-dealing. So, you know, there's a sense in which expertise is a denial of political access. It's opening up a kind of inequality of access to where real politics is under the guise of a knowing better than you. And of course, it affects precisely our class of people, people in academies, in universities, who are generating this superior brand of knowledge. And Ross Douthat, among other things, is also a Harvard graduate, like a number of us in this room. So this is another way in which technology is affecting the political subjectivity and agency of people. Again, a very recent commentary. And it's about the ways in which our ideas of self-fashioning, who we are as agents, who we even want to look like and become, is being affected by the social media. I mean, so it's not enough to talk about social media forming bubbles. It's actually affecting the ways in which people conceptualize themselves and their possibilities in a world, how they present themselves to other people. And it's an article about the emergence of the Instagram face. So our rapidly expiring, one of the oddest legacies of our rapidly expiring decade is the gradual emergence among professionally beautiful women of a single cyborgian face. It's young, poreless skin, plump, high cheekbones, cat-like eyes, long cartoonish lashes, and the physicians are busy crafting the faces to conform to that ideal of beauty. So a kind of uniformity that is being produced through our access to the visual dimensions of social media, and one should pay attention to that rise of the visual as a space in which politics is happening in different sorts of ways. And then, not trivially, where is the human today? So we are quite used to thinking of ourselves as the bearers of these rights. We're phenotypic animals by intuition. We think that here we are in our bodies, we look a certain way. There are endless images and representations that tell us that that is what the human is. But side by side with that representation of the human today are other representations of the human to which we do not know exactly what our relationship is. So there's the genetic human, the existence of the human genome and the data that it contains in all kinds of places, and with that an unresolved set of issues about our relationship to our own genotype. To whom does this belong? To whom does the information belong? And side by side with that, again, the rise of the data subject, the representation of all of us in the data points that we leave behind. It used to be thought that police work was about finding bits of hair and other leavings that people had left behind on their coffee cups or whatever, but today it's equally the traces that we leave through our shopping habits and so forth. So in some quite significant sense, the human today is at least a trifurcated being, that we exist in these shadow dimensions, and legally, constitutionally, our relationship to these other renditions of ourselves is far from sorted out, is far from clear. And that produces new socialities. So this is a quite famous New Yorker cover from 2009. It was the Halloween cover, and it shows the little children doing the classic thing on the porch, going trick-or-treating and knocking on the neighbor's door, but all the parents are standing on the sidewalk and each one is looking at his or her cell phone. So there are innumerable renditions of the alienation of modern life, but the question of, yesterday we were talking about solidarity, and yes, it is an extremely important thing to be talking about solidarity, but what is the image of solidarity conveyed in this image, in this picture, about a ritual that used to be, when I first went into the US in the mid-1950s, one of these organizing cultural moments. It was secular, everybody did Halloween, and the parents were out and the children were out, and it was a community building thing. But today we have the cell phone mediating that set of exchanges. So there's a kind of moral decentering that I think we need to talk about if we're really going to be talking about politics. I mean, if the common good is part of this sense of building solidarity, what is that common good when the human that was the bearer, the thinker about the common good, is itself decentered and manipulated, dispersed, reconstituted in a variety of ways? Right, so that's one set of questions. The next set of questions I want to turn to is the configurations of power. And here I want to take another aspect of social media. I want to take Facebook as an example, the example that I want to talk about. So there's Davos, and a little-known phenomenon there is something that happened on February 6th of 1996. And there was a declaration of independence. It was declared by this man, John Perry Barlow, of the Grateful Dead, and he wrote something called a Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. It began rhetorically with high-sounding words: governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. So where is sovereignty today? And one figure that one can follow around to ask about where sovereignty is, you could take any number of people, but this happens to be a nice little thing that one can capture in a few minutes in a public lecture. A while ago, Mark Zuckerberg appeared in front of Congress to answer questions about Cambridge Analytica. 2 days, 10 hours, 600 questions. What happened when Mark Zuckerberg went to Washington? So I'm interested in the performativity of politics. And one of the things that happened when Mark Zuckerberg went to Washington was that he went on an apology tour. Why did he go on an apology tour? The 33-year-old executive prepared for the hearings as if they were presidential debates, coordinating with a team of experts that included a former special assistant to President George W. Bush. He was ready to discuss topics from privacy to political polarization. So what is the self-image of this person? He's not appearing as a CEO. He's appearing as a presidential candidate groomed by the same people that groom presidential candidates. And the apology tour has become a performative, stylistic element of our presidential politics. So, here, for instance, is the roster of Democratic candidates, and they're all apologizing for various things. In this case, Elizabeth Warren apologizing for her somewhat clueless handling of her American Indian, Native American DNA, and there she's appearing in a group where she's doing the apology. But the fact is that there's one side of the political spectrum that does not apologize for anything, and there's another side of the political spectrum that does apologize for everything. But, this is a stylized aspect of politics that Mark Zuckerberg has picked up and understands and can give back in his own appearances in politics. He doesn't appear before all legislative bodies, so when the UK Parliament summoned him, he said no plans to go to UK to give evidence to MPs. So why is that? Whose sovereignty? Go back to John Perry Barlow's Declaration of Sovereignty. As a sovereign enterprise, he can decide which other sovereignties he's going to speak to or not speak to. Does he enact legislation? Well, certainly behind the scenes he does. And if we're talking about parliaments and who controls parliaments, we have to look at phenomena like this. Tech industry pursues a federal privacy law on its own terms. So people who know the tech industry privacy laws know that California is ahead of other states in terms of legislating privacy. And in this case, going federal means that you undermine the state prerogative, something that President Trump is doing in relation to environmental law and California exceptionalism. But on this matter, the tech industry is lined up with the Republican Party's interests, if you will. And then, last but not least, why not invent branches of government? And I'm not sure whether our very distinguished political law reporter is reporting on the Facebook Supreme Court with the same interest. So Facebook is going to have a Supreme Court. Will it work? And, they're currently given the somewhat underwhelming name of Oversight Board for Content Decisions. And the last sentence, nearly a year after first endorsing the idea, Facebook's benevolent dictator, Mark Zuckerberg, is giving his empire a Supreme Court. So we can go back to the idea of the Declaration of Independence and remind ourselves what kind of document it was. And it was a document with charges. And the charges are all directed at a person. No question about what the right pronoun was back in those days. It's he all the way down. But if you look at these charges, he has refused his assent to laws. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people. He has called together legislative, and one could add judicial, bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records. One could, without too much distortion, create a similar bill of charges against our mega corporations that are controlling one dimension of the human subject, the data subject, that has become a thing in our lives, like it or not. We all today have a data subject behind us, and as I say, its ontological relationship with us is not that obvious. Are countries and regions addressing this in the same way? No. The part of the digital divide that we all know and understand is that some people have computers and access to information and others do not. That has been called the digital divide for a long time. But if we look at the place and significance of the data subject, we can look at what's happening in Europe legally, and we can see a series of developments that are to some extent enshrined in GDPR, and those of you who are in the habit of crossing the Atlantic or going from any country to any other country know that the urgency and frequency of the "have you looked at your privacy settings" messages change as soon as you go from one place to another. So these are some elements of the GDPR. The right to be forgotten is the very first one, and that, of course, is a descendant of the Google Spain decision. But if you look at what's on the American side, you find that each of these provisions actually looks significantly different. So there's a right of information. There's no right to information removal. There is a First Amendment right to put information out there. And even things like what is a company responsible for doing, that varies according to which type of company. There isn't a single piece of legislation or regulation that attempts to systematize this across regions, and there are serious differences of legal and political thought about whether the European system is the one to go with or the American system is the one to go with. But the point is that to the extent that this other sovereignty has appeared that controls a dimension of our lives as citizens and as subjects, because we're all subject to that sovereignty, there is not uniformity today in the ways in which that relationship is being regulated or being put into the domain of control by us as we live in this world. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is the stakes in the future appearing as a place of politics. So this is something that my colleagues and I have written about in this edited volume, but the point about that edited volume is that it introduces a concept of sociotechnical imaginaries, and there are a couple of definitions, of which the second one is perhaps the more comprehensive and recent: collectively held, institutionally stabilized, and publicly performed visions of desirable futures, animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order, attainable through and supportive of advances in science and technology. So I don't know how many people in this room are familiar with the fact that futuring and future making have appeared as items of the research agenda just in the last 15 years or so. There are any number of places, particularly on this side of the Atlantic, that are taking up the future as a place that one studies socially, culturally, historically, and politically. And the political part is obviously what's significant to me in the context of what we're talking about here. So what are the stakes when the future becomes a place of politics? Well, in part, I mean, the reason to think of it as a place of socio-technical imaginaries is that science and technology have exceptional power to set before us images of the future that then seem desirable or undesirable, frightening or otherwise. And so this publicly performed visions of desirable futures, and one could add a codicil as well as undesirable futures. That's the risky future, that's Ulrich Beck's risk society. So, how do we think about the constitutional order when that is part of the picture? And I think that there's a whole set of changing political consciousnesses going on that we can put our fingers on, and I won't dwell on this in detail because there's no time for it, but one can find it in the rise of new sciences that are integrating nature and culture, for instance, like the sciences of the Anthropocene. One can see it in shifting ideas of constitutional rights for non-human entities. One can see it in the rise of ethics as a discourse of politics. And, for instance, computers and society entities have rebranded themselves as computer science and ethics. And one can see it, of course, in these demonstrations and marches against climate, such as Extinction Rebellion or Fridays for Future or Greta Thunberg's recent appearances. And let's not forget that she seized the position of Person of the Year in Time magazine from a person who dearly wants that accolade to be his. So, that is political turf as well. Are our deliberative forums equal to the task? And one can go through all of the deliberative forums in which we have something to say about the future and point to problems with them. So regulation, the market, science and industry themselves as arbiters of the future, and institutional ethics. And for each one, and I won't bother reading, there are drawbacks to why these forums are not adequate. So I think we have, with justice, dwelled on the flaws and inadequacies of our existing institutions, such as, is the Israeli Supreme Court becoming too autonomous and treading into political territory and crafting rules that do not hold up against tests of democratic politics. And of course, that analysis needs to continue. But what I see from my vantage point in looking at science and technology as the lenses through which to look at political transformations is the utter lack, the absence of deliberative spaces where we take extraordinarily foundational questions, like who is the human subject? What is even at stake in talking about the human subject? What is a political agent? Even what is politics? What is sovereignty? I mean, forget about soft power or hard power. Smart power wielded by Facebook is not the same as smart power wielded by an Office of Science and Technology Policy that is sitting in the White House. So I think we have to get really foundational, and I very much welcome the discussions that we've been having, and I'm extremely grateful to have been part of it. So with that, let me thank you and conclude.
There's time for one question.
Oh, there is.
There is time for one question. So let me ask it. You've mentioned and discussed the US and Europe. You've mentioned the US and Europe. You have not mentioned countries that currently are not functional democracies at all, but they have all these same technological achievements. Can you spend 1 minute saying why you have not discussed those?
Right. I mean, you could have been less polite and said, why aren't you talking about China, which is the version of the question I usually hear. So, there are lots of good reasons. I mean, first of all, it's not obvious to me that nation states any longer are such enclosed bodies that putting in another or more, I mean, there's not just China with its billions, but also India with its billions, and India has actually the most far-reaching identification technology that it's introduced over the last decade, the Aadhaar project, that creates a very different understanding of who the subject is as a data point in the eyes of the beholder. I think that rather than multiplying entities, trying to go back to what are the questions we should be asking about these transformations is the place where I would rather be. One can transpose these questions and say, so what does the idea of citizenship look like? Yesterday we were talking about marches, and it's not totally clear to me what China is at the moment, given that Hong Kong is part of China, and we haven't talked about the umbrella demonstrations or the current upheavals, let alone in the historical context of what happened between Tiananmen and Hong Kong. I mean, so, there may be a kind of democracy fatigue in the West, but it's not necessarily democracy fatigue in the places that don't have it. I am doing something extremely focused on this question of how to do the multiple cultures thing around genome editing, where that the shocking disclosure came out of China. And I'm trying actually to construct a new kind of forum where we would have the conversations that I see as radically missing under the heading of what we call cosmopolitan ethics, between systems where some of these very foundational questions, like what is power and who is the subject, are addressed in very different ways.
Thank you very much.